Hello and welcome to this pickup discussion video in which I'm going to be discussing the ins and outs of pickups. Now, before I begin on any of the content, let me say this is going to be a long video. So there will be timestamps in the description below so you can see what you want to pick and choose. Before I get into this video, let's give it a bit of context. I've been building pickups for about 3 years now, 2 of those years as a professional, and the questions that I get from customers are more or less the same thing dressed up different ways. So there seems to be an awful lot of myths and misconceptions going about. So this video is just about looking at those and trying to answer them as a professional and tell you what the answers are to them, what's false and what's true. So the logical place to start this video is to discuss what a pickup is and what it's doing in your guitar. And we can start with a Stratocaster single coil. So a Stratocaster single coil is simply one coil of magnet wire around 6 Alnico rods, and this wire is hooked up to the 2 leads that usually come off a Stratocaster single coil, and those connect to the start and the end of the wire, and that wire is directly on those Alnico rods, and it's 6 Alnico rods for 6 strings, so each one charges up an individual string. And what these do is, the strings are ferrous, so as it charges those, the ferrous string, which is now magnetised, and essentially the magnet to the coil now, the magnets don't actually cause any sound in the pickup themselves, it's the magnetism of the string that does that. And as that moves, it creates a charge in the pickup itself, and this charge comes out through the output wires. And as you play, this charge changes in intensity, in frequency, and goes into your amp, and that's what the music is basically. That's a Stratocaster single coil, which is more or less the most simple pickup design there is out there. And then the next progression was probably the Humbucker, which, as you can see, is 2 coils, and these coils are wound in reverse to each other, and this is, as the name suggests, to buck hum. And as you can notice as well, these are not Alnico rods, these are steel slugs. And that's because they're charged with the magnet, which hopefully you should see there, right under the coils there. And that charges both the screws and the slugs of the pickup, which gives it completely a different tone before we start discussing the hum cancellation, the frequency cancellation, the coil geometry, the more winds, and tons of other things that go into the makeup of what makes it sound like that. And yeah, because it's a bar magnet, for instance, this is south, this is north, or vice versa, either way they're differently charged. So the piece of string that's vibrating above each coil here is charged differently, which basically means no noise is cancelled and they're not out of phase. But the nasty noise, the hum that is bucking, is for the most part removed. And with those 2 designs inspected, we have a good idea of what every pickup's going to sound like, because more or less every single pickup is some sort of alteration of the design of a Stratocaster single coil, which originally was a Telecaster single coil, a small adaptation of that, and a humbucker, which there's plenty of adaptations, mini humbuckers and Firebirds and stuff like that. So those are really good benchmarks to know how they differ, and then as I go into the more finer details of what goes into how a pickup sounds, so you can take the benchmark of what a normal humbucker sounds like, for instance, and then go, okay, this is smaller, therefore it has less winds on it and thicker wire. Now, there's probably a lot of people watching this video going, I'm happy with my pickups, they don't cause me any problems, why would I bother throwing money at it if it's not an issue? And to prove how much of a difference pickups can make, I want you to think of Jimi Hendrix and Iron Maiden, and specifically Dave Murray from Iron Maiden. And this is because Jimi Hendrix and Dave Murray from Iron Maiden both used Strat and early Marshalls. And for the most part, the difference between their tone, other than what comes from their fingers obviously, is in the pickups. And that's because Jimi Hendrix used the typical 60s Stratocaster single coil, and Dave Murray used Stratocaster sized humbuckers. So the main tonal difference between Dave Murray's Stratocaster-sized humbucker and Jimi Hendrix's early Stratocaster single coil is that the humbucker, it has a much higher output, so it will drive the amp a lot harder into higher levels of distortion. It also has a lot more mid-range, it also has a lot less treble, and just the general characteristics of the pickup just sound fundamentally different. So from this, you should be able to conclude that pickups really can make a significant difference to your tone. And these are two completely different sides of the spectrum, so you can have far more subtle differences if you're going between like a 60s style and a 50s style Stratocaster single coil. You're not going to see anywhere near that amount of difference, but you know, if you're a bedroom player, then you'll hear the differences. Okay, two different pickups, completely different side of the spectrum, do sound different, but how do I know which is the best pickup for me? And that's a pretty hard question to answer, and really depends on your taste. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the video basically is break down all the factors that go into what makes a pickup sound the way it does. So you can take a benchmark of whatever pickups you have, if you have the specifications to hand, and go, okay, I don't like this, it has too much treble, so I want this magnet instead, or I want more output, so I need more winds on it. And I'm going to break down everything into the most simple terms I possibly can, so that hopefully anyone of any ability or knowledge regarding pickups should be able to follow this. What are the factors that make up what a pickup sounds like? And there's two main factors and one set of external factors. There's the coil, which depends on the geometry, the wire type, the wire gauge, which I will discuss in further detail. There's the magnet type, which it's not just the magnet type, but how the magnetism is transferred to the string as well. So Alnico 5 bar magnet with steel slugs, steel screws is not going to sound the same as Alnico 5 rods in a Stratocaster or a Telecaster, for instance, pickup. And then the external factors are covers, which you can really notice on Telecaster neck. Cover material as well. As I say, Telecaster neck is probably the best example for this because everything lines up to be the most treble losses possible, which is why Telecaster necks are always so dark. The cover is close to the coil, so it causes eddy currents, capacitance, all of which remove treble. It reduces the output of it as well, because of both those things, and the fact that it physically means that you can't move it very close to the strings. So that doesn't actually change the tone of the pickup, but when you're using it, obviously it means you can't get as high output as you would otherwise. They're made out of brass, which is known to have very high eddy currents. Actually, I've got one here. You can see it sits. This is a tool pickup. You can see it sits directly on the windings there, so it really does have a large effect on it all. And as well as covers, there's capacitance from the capacitor in your tone control. There's potentiometers. The value of those higher value potentiometers bleed off less treble. So if you have 250, that's not always single coils, because single coils are known for being bright. Usually you go for 500 with humbuckers because they are naturally darker than single coils, so that compensates either way for either of them. Before you begin your holy grail tone searching quest, let's begin with a few myths that I commonly see. And the one I see by far the most is resistance equals output. Now, for the most part, this is quite accurate, but it's not. The two things generally follow a correlation, but there are pickups that have very high resistances that are really low output, and vice versa. So the resistance of a pickup depends on three things, I guess. First, the wire gauge. As you have thinner wire, the resistance per foot goes up. So, let's start with what output is. Output is how many winds are on a pickup and how powerful the magnet is. So if you have a really powerful magnet and lots of winds, you have a really high output pickup. So as I just said with the wire gauge, more winds, generally higher output pickups have lots of winds, so there's only so much space on the bobbins to accommodate the windings. So as you take the wire and you wind it loads and loads of times, if you're using thick wire, you run out of space. So generally people go to thinner wire if they want higher output or more winds. And for this reason, that's why it generally follows the trend. And as you wind even more, obviously using a longer length of wire, so that increases the resistance. And another factor that goes into it is the geometry of the coil itself. If you have a coil that you only have to wind, say, that much around to get a whole wind, that's going to be lower than a coil that uses that much to go around the whole thing. So that's not going to tell you the wind count, and regardless of the length of it, it's the same amount of winds are going to be the same level of output. So it's generally, you can work out the output of a pickup if you know the gauge of wire, because generally humbuckers, Stratocaster single coils, Telecaster single coils, it's all the lengths and the sizes and the geometry of the bobbins and coils and whatever else it's being wound over are the same, so you just need the gauge of wire. And once you know that, you could, or at least if you have two pickups that have the same gauge of wire, then you can go, right, this one is 42 gauge, which is the most commonly used in pickup building, and this one is also 42. This is 9K and this is 8K. They both have the same magnets, therefore the magnetic field is the same. You can go for sure that 8K is going to be less than the 9K. But if you're comparing it with 44, for instance, then, well, as a general rule of thumb, 42 is the thickest, and as you go up gauges, the wire gets thinner. So 42 is the thickest, 43 is the middle, 44 is usually as thin as it gets. Some people wind with 45. The rule of thumb to know is that as you go to 42 to 43, 43 to 44, you're increasing the resistance for a set number of winds by approximately about 25%. So if you're looking at 10K of, I'm going to use 10K of 42, which you probably can't actually fit on the bobbins, but I'm just using it as an example. 10K of 42 is going to be equivalent of about 12.5 of 43, and then add another 25% of that, which is going to be 15.5, 16ish, is going to be the equivalent in 44. So if you know the gauge of two winds, and they're not the same, then you can use that calculation, as long as all the other factors are equal. On to the next myth, and that is, I love player X. Player X plays through pickup Y, therefore if I buy pickup Y and I love player X, pickup Y is definitely the right pickup for me. And I can tell you from personal experience, that's not true. For instance, I think the best guitar tone, it's probably going to sound cliche, but I think Sweet Child of Mine, the intro riff that Slash plays, is just absolutely glorious, the guitar tone on that. He plays an Alnico 2 Pro, neck position on that. I've tried one, I didn't get along with it at all. I still think it's the best tone ever recorded, but yeah, I didn't get on because it didn't get on with my playstyle, it didn't get on with my amplification, and it's not about, unless you're on if you are in a band that plays and you're trying to cover it as closely, maybe a tribute band for instance, then yeah, probably that is the way to go. But if you're not, and you're just searching for what works best for you, listen with your own ears, I think, is the best advice there, because no one else can tell you what the best pickup is for you. You need a benchmark, and then you need to move with your own opinion from that benchmark. Next myth, and it's not so much a myth as an attitude that a lot of people go into pickup buying with, and that's that I like pickup A from manufacturer B, therefore I should only search manufacturer B for pickups like pickup A. And that's not really true, because manufacturers have a huge array of pickups that they build. I can guarantee from any manufacturer you will find a pickup that you love and a pickup that you hate. And how good they are is the advice that they can give you, the descriptions, the sound clips, whatever else, that get you to that right pickup. So you should never only look at certain brands for certain things. And you shouldn't think just because I like a pickup from this brand, therefore I'm going to like every single one from that brand, because that's really not the case. more so than that, you should look at the factors that go into the pickup, because if you read between the lines, generally you can work out how it's made. You can compare that between manufacturers. Generally manufacturers all give the same sort of information, which usually they don't give wire gauge, but you can usually work that out based on how high it is and what size the pickup is. So if you can work out the maximum of wines of a certain gauge that can go on there, say 9.5k of 42 on humbucker bobbins, you see a pickup that's at 12k, you know it's definitely not 42. 12k is almost always going to be 43. And then if you know another pickup's 43, then you can go, right, okay, compare the outputs of those two now. Alright, next myth, and that is that expensive pickups, ones that with good reputations, that everyone says this is great for rock, this is great for metal, this is great for jazz, etc., are the best pickups, and you should disregard all others. And that's untrue, because pickups depend on taste. So one person's taste almost certainly won't be your own. So unfortunately that means you have to test lots of pickups to find out what your taste is, unless you're really lucky and you hit it first time, which does sometimes happen. So it's by that, it means don't just go for the expensive high end and go, right, this is expensive, therefore it's superior. And I think that's a big misconception about pickups. No pickup is superior to another. Maybe in terms of durability, some may be. If you have a really expensive one that's well made and well protected, got a good humbucker cover and baseplate and stuff, it's pretty much indestructible. Then yeah, maybe you have a point. That one is better from a durability standpoint. But if you're looking from simply a tonal standpoint, there's not really any truth in that, because it all comes down to your opinion. So if you look at Chinese ones, they usually use not too many ones because it saves them on copper wire, makes them cheaper. They use ceramic magnets because they're cheaper than alnico. And I'm talking generic China. There's lots of Chinese pickups that are well made, follow US specifications and sound just as good as the US alternatives. But for the cheap ones, for instance, most people don't like them. Most people write them off just because they are cheap. But I'm sure there's loads of people out there. I, for one, I had a really cheap Ibanez, which had a cheap pickup based on a super distortion, I think, and still to this day think that's one of the best pickups I've ever had. And you could probably buy it on eBay for about £2. And that's just because all the factors came together and they sounded great, and it sounded great to my ear. And that's all it is. It's a combination of factors, and while expensive ones may have loads and loads of research and development that have gone into them, cheap Chinese ones that come off an assembly line and the quality control's all over the place, well, they may just hit a recipe that sounds really good to your ears. So you can't disregard anything immediately like that. And last myth that I'm going to cover in this video is going to be that it's just the general opinion that alnico sounds like this, ceramic sounds like this, active pickups sound like this, and for the most part is not really true. For the most part, how they sound is relative to each other. So a lot of people are going to say, I won't touch a ceramic pickup because they're always shrill, they're always brittle, they're always really harsh. And if you put it in the wrong pickup, yeah, it is going to sound that way. But if you put a magnet that's shrill, harsh, bright in a coil wind that's naturally really dark and boomy, then you're going to get a balanced pickup. So if you try to pick up, which you know is ceramic, for instance, and you go that sharp, brittle, awful, really trebly, and you go and say, I'm never touching a ceramic pickup again, well, you're going about it the wrong way. You need to look at it as, say it's a cake. You say, I don't like the recipe for that cake. You don't say, I don't like cake anymore. Yeah, it's how everything interacts together. I think the one sentence that summarises what I'm trying to say is there are no absolutes in pickups. You can never go to one factor of a pickup and go, I don't like that factor, so I'm never going to touch it again. Because chances are, if the other factors work together with that in a way that you like, then you'll find a pickup that has that certain factor which will sound good to you. Let's move on to some of the finer factors that go into a pickup, and let's start with wire gauge. I've already waffled on about how wire gauge means more turns and higher resistance and all the rest of it. But what does it actually do to the sound of the pickup? Well, as wire gauge gets thinner, or the number goes up as I've already discussed, that means the winds of wire sit closer to each other. And as these wires in the coil sit closer to each other, that means that there's higher capacitance, and that's essentially, it's like you have a capacitor to ground from the pickup, and the closer they sit, the higher the value of the capacitor, which, if you don't know about electronics, basically means that more treble is bled off it. So you get a darker sound, you get more MIDI and more bass heavy, and you lose a lot of your treble. That in conjunction with the wind count, because higher winds means even more of this wire sitting closer, so again it's just like a bigger capacitor with a longer length of wire sitting even closer to each other. And that's generally why you see PAFs, early Stratocaster, Telecaster, usually the brightest types of pickups, and that's because they're wound with the widest wire. And if the wire is the widest, then it sits further away from each other because it physically can't get too close. And it's for this reason that treble is preserved, and why high output pickups, as I've already said, high output means more winds, and there's only so much space on the bobbin, so with thinner wire, well, the only way you can do it is with thinner wire. So when you use thinner wire, you get higher output, and you also lose treble. So that's why you look at like JB, super distortion and stuff. Generally they're a bit darker. An awful lot of that is compensated by the magnet, which JB uses Alnico 5. Super distortion uses a large ceramic, and I will cover magnets shortly. And what that means is essentially they're using the brightest magnets to try to bring some more of that treble that's already been lost through the coil itself back into the pickup. So to conclude that point that I went a very long-winded way about explaining, essentially resistance is probably a general idea of the EQ of the pickup, and you can probably compare that against different gauges as well, and that's what the next video is going to be about. I've got two pickups, one of which is wound with 42.5 AWG to 9.5, and the other one is wound with much thinner 44 AWG, also to 9.5, using exactly the same for everything other than the wire, and obviously the wind count to get the same resistance between them. And yeah, let's put them back to back and see how similar they sound, and see if my theory holds up. So, as you can hear, they do sound pretty similar, but there is a big output difference. So let's increase the gain on the amp of the 44 AWG pickup to round about the same level of gain, or rather distortion, that's coming from the 42.5 with the prior amp settings, and then let's see back to back what they sound like then. Now, the next major factor that you need to think of for pickups is the magnets that are in them. And not just the magnets, but how the magnetic field is transferred up to the string, which, for the most part, in every pickup, people generally are conservative, so in humbuckers you're almost always going to see screws and slugs. There are subtle differences if you have double slugs, double screws, But for the most part, you can compare magnets between pickups and they're going to be more or less exactly the same. The difference being Alnico rods against the normal humbucker steel screw and slug arrangement, but you very rarely see Alnico slugs on humbuckers and screws and slugs on single coil pickups, so that's very, very niche. And for that reason, we can compare the Alnicos, and as a general, not just Alnico, but ceramic that you quite commonly see as well. And the common ones are Alnico 2, Alnico 3, Alnico 4, Alnico 5, Alnico 8, and ceramic. And generally, as you go up, the numbers for Alnico is stronger, apart from Alnico 3. Alnico 3 is the weakest, so it goes Alnico 3, Alnico 2, Alnico 4, Alnico 5, and then Alnico 8. And ceramic is stronger than all of them. And as a general rule, you will find stronger magnets in high output pickups, and that tightens the bass up. It scoops out the mids, which usually, as they're overwound, they will have more mids in the coil itself, and adds a lot of treble, which they usually lose a lot of treble as well. So it's generally a spectrum, and weakest has the most mids, it has the squishiest bass. People say it's musical, so if you have it in a low output pickup that you're using clean, then it does have a softness about it, which can be quite pleasing. And as you go up, people say it becomes more harsh, you get more treble, it scoops out the mids, so that's really good if you're playing with high gain. And with Alnico and ceramic comparisons and stuff, as I've already said, there's no absolutes, so it really depends on the other factors of the pickup, which I'm repeating throughout this whole video because that really is the takeaway from this. Well, let's just compare them back to back. I've got a very middle of the road humbucker at 9.5k of 42.5, so slightly, it's about the output of a PAF bridge pickup, but slightly warmer because of the thinner wire. And that should give a good demonstration of all the pickup types. And the next factor that can really affect how a pickup sounds is the covers and bass plates, or any sort of metal that's close to the coil. And this is because of eddy currents which build up as a charge is made in the coil. Then in the close metal it creates an opposite charge which opposes that, and that really loses a lot of treble, and it is based on how big the cover is, or the base plate, how close it is to the coil, and the material as well. You've probably heard a lot of people going brass against nickel silver, and nickel silver does lose a lot less, which any cover or any base plate close to the coil is going to have some effect, but people say nickel silver is a lot more subtle and brass is a lot worse, which brass is found commonly on Telecaster neck pickups, and they are traditionally very dark, so for experience that sounds correct. So let's go into an A-B comparison of brass, uncovered, and nickel silver cover. And another thing to consider when you're buying pickups is, what do you want to do with the pickup? Now, you do with, this is Humbucker specifically, if you have 4-conductor, and that's really important, I emphasise 4-conducter, you cannot do this with braided and single conductor output wire. It has to be 4-conductor to have access to split and parallel modes. And what you can do with these modes is you can shut off one of the coils for split mode, and that makes it into sort of a single coil, like a Stratocaster single coil. It's not exactly the same because of the magnets, the coil geometry, the amount of winds on it, but you get something that's reasonably close to it. If you have a higher output humbucker, for instance, you do have a darker coil wind, typically because of more winds and thinner wire, and usually get a better sound. So if you are shopping about and you're going, okay, I am going to put split or parallel operation into this pickup, you might think, okay, I like low output humbuckers, but that split coil sound is really important to me. So you might want to compromise and go, okay, I'll go a little bit higher output, just so that that split or parallel sound is going to sound a bit better. And parallel is much the same. It's not exactly the same, but well, you'll hear in the next clip how similar they are. But parallel keeps both coils. It's like a Stratocaster if you're in position 2 or 4. Now, something I see a lot is people being really hung up on the string spacing of their pickup. And this is the space between the individual poles, So on a Stratocaster single coil it would be the space between, but generally it's measured as the centre of the two outer poles, and this is the same on humbuckers, P90s, everything. And generally people get really hung up that they say it must align perfectly with the strings, because as you see on your guitar, the strings do come in at an angle to the pickup, so it does get wider towards the bridge, and different bridges do have different string spacings, and for the most part is cosmetic, especially with Stratocaster pickups, because Fender in the early days, and I think they do it for most reissues as well, they always use 52 regardless of the string spacing. So in the neck, usually the strings would be way inside, in the bridge sometimes they'd be outside. They didn't align very well, but Alnico rods are so strong that the magnetic field is pretty much identical, even if it's just slightly outside the poles. And for that reason, alignment is really not all that necessary. A lot of people will argue if it's really far out, then you will get dropout on your high and your low E, which is correct, but if it's only slightly out, or even if it isn't centered, it should sound exactly the same. So it really is a cosmetic thing, so you shouldn't get too hung up on it. To a lesser extent, humbuckers as well, but because of the steel screws and slugs and Alnico magnets underneath the coils, it is slightly more of an issue there. Finally, the installation of your pickups, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because I could go into an awful lot of detail, and I probably will in a future video going over exactly the process of replacing pickups. But as a general rule, if you're going and watching this video and thinking, I've never replaced pickups before, I have no idea how it's done, let me say that if you've never touched a soldering iron before, you'll probably be able to do it with probably about an hour's work, I reckon. It's really simple job if you take it slowly, step by step, and the really important thing is when you're removing your old pickups to remember exactly where they come out. You don't need to read any wiring diagram if you're just replacing them and not changing anything else. You literally just take off, you melt the solder, take off the old ones, put the new ones on, melt a little bit of solder. It really is a very simple job, and it's probably the easiest job for anyone who hasn't soldered before to begin soldering. So I don't think there's really any barrier for entry in terms of soldering for someone buying replacement pickups if they want to try and install them themselves rather. And if you don't want to, if you're really worried, if you've got a really expensive guitar for instance and you don't want to go melting holes in the front of it or the back of it, which I'm not sure how you would, you'd have to be very clumsy to do that, then you can always take it to a tech, and it's not a very expensive job. As I've just said, it's a pretty quick job, so it shouldn't be expensive. And even if you are completely solder shy, especially if you're shopping active pickups, almost all active pickups come with a 3-pin output from the bottom of the pickup, which they use clips, and they just clip. You just slide them on, there's no soldering whatsoever. So if you're changing EMGs or Seymour Duncan blackouts, I know they also have them, a lot of Chinese copies of active pickups also have them, chances are you won't even be soldering at all. So if you've got active pickups, for the most part it's usually pretty safe. Of course there is a large process that you have to go if you want to go active to passive, which will involve a lot of soldering, but if you're just going active to active, then most of the time you're going to get away without doing any soldering whatsoever. Now I'm going to try to summarise this very long video into about 1 minute for people who don't want to watch the whole video, and just to conclude it. And that is, if you're in the market for pickups, you need some sort of baseline. You need a pickup that you already have, you know what all the specifications are of it, and you need to decide where you want to go from that tone. You need to know how all the factors work, and I break those all down throughout the video, so check the timestamps if you're not watching the whole video, for which you have confusions over and how they affect it all. You need to know how all the factors work together. You need to know what your amplification is like, and if it's too bright then you want a darker pickup, vice versa. And you need to know the external factors, such as cable length can also affect it as well. You need to know what sort of music you play, such as punk for instance, you want quite a lot of distortion, so you want a higher output pickup as a general rule. And you need, nothing of this works in a vacuum, so you really need to think of all these factors as the recipe, and everything comes together. And with all those things being said, when you are going and purchasing a pickup, don't take the word of anyone else. You really need to do it on your own opinion and your own experiences, because everyone's tastes vary significantly. Thank you for watching this very long video, and if you liked what you saw, like, subscribe, etc. You know the drill. And if you didn't like, put it in the comments. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And next video is going to be about guitar electronics. So there's lots of videos out there on how to wire a guitar up, but I'm planning on going a step further and going through all the electronics and going, this is exactly how a potentiometer works, this is how it works on an electrical level, what you can do with it, and switches and etc.